All right, so it should be recording now. All right. Hi, everyone. We'll get started here. Welcome to this GoDaddy Pro meetup. My name is Jai. I'm a technical account manager here at GoDaddy, primarily supporting people who are on the managed WordPress hosting. And joining me today is Alex Stanford. Alex, did I say that right? Yep.
Yes, you said that right. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So he's just joined GoDaddy. For those of you who caught the sort of the tail end of that, Alex, this is his I believe second week here at GoDaddy. He's the senior software engineer, primarily focused on e-commerce. So welcome, Alex. I know there's more you're doing, so you can maybe touch on that as we go along. And just to cover what this this is going to be a three-part series. Alex will walk us through different ways to approach creating WordPress blocks. We'll start with why you should consider creating and using blocks compared to the classic editor, and help you get started quickly to creating blocks without code. And disclaimer, this is my first time hosting, so Courtney has been very generous and gracious in helping me along through here. So Alex, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and all the good stuff is in the presentation. Okay, so this is called Coding Optional Part 1. We're going to talk about how to get started making Gutenberg blocks quickly. As it was alluded to, this is a three-part series. This is the first part. And in this one, we are going to talk about why you would want to use the block editor versus ACF in the first place. We're also going to touch a little bit on some of the benefits of the block editor over the classic, how it impacts your process and how it, can change just how you write your code and how you work through your process on a day-to-day basis building custom themes. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and just jump into this real quick. First and foremost, let's share a little bit about who am I and why should you listen to me? You don't have to, but if you want to, that's cool. My name's Alex. It's a pleasure to meet you. I've been around WordPress since 2009. I built my first WordPress website at that point, where I spent my time building a WordPress website for myself, that taught people how to do tutorials with the photo editor GIMP. And I worked with that for a little while and kind of reached a point where I got stuck, where I couldn't do anything else without writing code. So I started to learn how to get into the code and write the code. And before I know it, I was really just like, man, this is cool. I really enjoy doing this. Maybe I should, get a career in this. So I left my career of 10 years working as a mechanical engineer and became a web developer. And the rest is kind of history. From that point on, I basically started doing client work where I was building dozens of websites and quite literally hundreds of WordPress plugins. And from there, I've kind of expanded my career into working on being a contributor for some well-known plugins like Affiliate WP. And as has been alluded to, I'm now working with GoDaddy on the e-commerce side of some of their hosting offerings for WordPress. So it's nice to meet you. I've been here for a while. I love what I do, and I'm excited to share this with you. So the first thing that I really want to get into is the differences between the block editor and the actual, sorry, one second. I got to make sure my notes are working here. There we go. So let's start by getting into the benefits. The big difference here is that the block editor uses blocks, which are just individual components that build a website, and the classic editor uses templates, right? So if you think about it, that's kind of the fundamental difference between the two. The classic editor just relies on templates. So if I wanted to build a homepage layout, for example, which every site has, most of the time, whenever I would do it using the classic editor, I would build it usually using something like ACF or something like that to create the custom fields that are necessary to make it customizable. But at the end of the day, the layout and the very build of that page itself is static. I can make it very customizable, and I can make it to where, you know, you can add and remove content from that site in a very fluid manner. But if any changes ever needed to be made to that layout, it basically ended up needing to be a code change. The block editor handles this a little bit differently. You still get a lot of the benefits of the customizations that a template-based paradigm has, but you also get the ability to change the layout too. And that's because the block editor, again, relies on blocks. So instead of building that homepage layout using a hard-coded template, you would instead build the blocks that make up that template so that you can then reuse those blocks in other pages later on. So let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits that really creates, because like I said, on the surface, it kind of seems kind of similar, right? Because you're basically writing code and making it customizable, or you're writing code and you're making it customizable. No matter what, really, from a 10,000 foot view, blocks in the classic editor kind of look the same and they kind of feel the same. But whenever you get closer and you talk about how this all works and how this impacts it, you can really see some of the big differences. And the first one that comes to mind for me is fewer code changes. Something that my agency had always had has a lot of success with is retainers. So that's really where we have always made our money. That's where we've sustained ourselves. You know, projects are nice. They're good injections of income. But the things that really kept the lights on at the end of the day were those ongoing retainers. And the best way to be able to maximize the profit on those retainers is to minimize the number of code changes you have to make whenever you are actually maintaining those sites. So some of our clients are very much DIY kind of people, right? Where they want to do it all themselves. They're the, or even sometimes they even came to us, had already done it themselves, realized they're in over their head and came to us. But at the end of the day, you also have clients who don't want to touch it at all, and they just want you to deal with it. And no matter what, both of those people, if there needs to be a change where you have to make a code change, it takes time, it takes resources, and it takes money, which cuts into on your retainers. So if you can cut back on those code changes as much as you can, obviously the better off you're going to be. And with blocks, they're intended to be used and reused without writing more code. Again, we're not building static templates here. We're building components that can be reused throughout the site. We're, you know, basically assembling them inside of the block editor itself. So if a change needs to be made that, so more changes that need made can be done without code. And ironically enough, designers actually usually build blocks anyway. So it's not like you're actually relying on this whole separate process or anything like that, because because most of the time the designers have already built the design system. They've already kind of built the blocks whenever they did it in the design phase anyway. We as developers are just putting them into a template. So we're kind of already, most agencies are already there, at least all the agencies I've ever worked with. The process starts with a designer, you know, creating that design and then giving it to a developer. So you kind of get this, in this dynamic where you're really just creating the design intent, and you're allowing that design intent to be used inside of the editor instead of having to rely on code to do it. Another benefit, and this one might be a little controversial, is that the block editor is actually pretty easy to customize. This is not something that you hear a lot. Common theme and the common complaint about it is that, and that, you know, creating custom blocks is this big, crazy, difficult challenge. And it's not completely false. The reality is there is a lot of technology that is used to make the block editor and make blocks that isn't used anywhere else, that wasn't used anywhere else in the classic editor prior to. However, I have found that once I got the hang of React and JavaScript and all of the tools that are used custom Gutenberg blocks, that we were actually able to develop and create custom blocks faster than we were able to create custom meta boxes and other interfaces that are necessary otherwise. And that includes both in the context of writing custom code and also working with ACF or something like that. Because in fact, you can actually use something that we do a lot is we use ACF to build blocks instead of ACF to build fields for rigid templates. We also use another thing called lazy blocks, which I'll get into that a lot more in the next talk. But the key point here is that, contrary to popular belief, it's not harder, it's just different. And once you learn the tools, you actually find that it's pretty smooth and it works pretty darn well. A lot of the resistance from the simple fact that there's a barrier to entry. You have to learn React, you have to learn JavaScript, and you have to learn Webpack to really be able to do this effectively. But even if you don't have those tools, like I said, you can always use ACF and lazy blocks and tools that'll help you build these blocks without writing code just as fast and as efficiently as you would if you were to do it using the classic editor with those same tools. It's generally faster to do this using the block-based approach than the static template-based approach. And my findings, it's about a 25% savings, I'd say, roughly, on most of the sites that we've done. I find that most of the time that we've spent building sites now using the block editor is, like I said, about 25% faster than the sites that we were building prior to using static templates in the same method. And really, that's just simply because we're spending less time building markup, writing CSS, because a lot of these blocks already have that CSS built in, a lot of that stuff that you have to do again and again and again, right? I mean, how many times have you had to build a set of, cards, 3 cards with a little call to action, a text, and an icon, and act in a single column, and then on mobile, then you did display as a single row. It's a very common scenario that, we would just build. We would build it again and again and again. Now, we were using things like Bootstrap and stuff to help speed up the process, but ultimately we were really just redoing that stuff. And the block editor comes with something called the columns block, for example, that allows you to literally take a block and put it inside of a set of columns inside of WordPress without writing any additional code. The only thing you'd have to write, maybe, is the block inside that, you would end up putting inside of the columns. So, just things like that really saved us a lot of time. There have been times where I've built entire sites and have not needed to write any code on the pages themselves. I had to write, code for the header and the footer and all the widget areas and the CSS, a little bit of CSS to make all that look nice. But the actual page layouts themselves, I didn't have to touch. And because outside of just building them inside of the block editor, because the block editor already had everything I needed. And that saved us a lot of time. Especially whenever you start looking at libraries that are coming out, like GhostKit, and I can't think of any other ones off the top of my head. I use GhostKit a lot, so that's the one that comes to mind. But they extend and offer other blocks and additional blocks that you can add to your site to be able to just give you more tools to build. Of course, I'm a little ambivalent too many block libraries, because I kind of feel like it's going to be the modern day plugin problem, where you're going to run into a site someday that has 15 different block libraries because they want one block from all 15 of them. I don't really want to get into that. I don't want to do that. So I just try to stick to 1 or 2 really good block libraries, and then combine that with some kind of block building tool like ACF or lazy blocks, and then use that for most of my budget conscious clients. And then whenever the time comes and there's a justification where maybe we're using the same block again and again and again, maybe at that point I would then go through with the trouble of actually building it, hard coding it in with JavaScript and React and all that stuff. And I'll get into that a little bit more later, though. The code is easy to reuse. And this is kind of what I was just starting to talk about. You can reuse your blocks on other sites, right? Because that's the purpose. That's kind of the big picture of blocks. If you look at it on a single site, the goal is to be able to set it up to where you can build a site and create other pages and create other layouts and do all these things. But if you take it a step further than that, you can even say, I can take this block and I can put it on a whole different website. And depending on how specific and how that block was built, it'll just work. It'll fit in, it'll look nice, and we can, set it up to where it can be customized using the theme JSON file to make it applicable to this site. And it just gives you a lot of power if you think about it, especially if you're niched down. One of the niches I was in for a little while was craft beer. So I was making specifically for breweries. And, when I was niching down there, this was before the block editor, but I built a WordPress plugin that allows me to manage beers and what's on tap and all this stuff. And if I were to do that today, I would definitely have my own custom block library that makes working with beers, unique and awesome, and set it up to where if you want access to these blocks and all these tools and all this stuff, you got to come to us. Either that or I sell it, but I would probably, taking an agency model, I would say, come to us. This is the editing experience that we offer with WordPress. These are the benefits that you're going to get that you can't get from anybody else. And all of that would lean on blocks because they're easy to reuse and they create a powerful way to create this really great experience that's hyper specific to whatever industry you're focused on. Now, of course, there's other use cases for reusing blocks, such as, again, the testimonial block that we just talked about. Maybe you have a specific type of client that's, maybe they're not so tech savvy and they are ambivalent about the idea of working with something like the block editor because it doesn't look anything like Microsoft Word, which is kind of the big thing, the big criticism I hear a lot about people wanting to stick with the Tiny MCE classic editor is, they have a specific set of clientele that's their problem. And if you have clients like that, you could even go as far as building blocks, creating blocks that simplify the complexity of building one. So maybe instead of creating a layout where there's 3 columns and then you put the testimonials in each individual column, maybe you take that whole thing and you just create a block custom that does that one time, and then you have access to it. And you can use a repeater field inside of it, just like what you're doing now. And then that way, now you still have the benefits of using and working with the block editor. And if you, as the more tech savvy expert, have a need to, you can still lean on that and take advantage of that, but you can still create blocks that are simplified as much as possible for your clients that are specific to their needs. So you're still kind of getting the best of both worlds, right? You're still able to give yourself this powerful block editing experience that has all the benefits that I've already talked about so far, while simultaneously simplifying that process and simplifying that experience for your customers. So all of that just comes from the idea of the code's easy to reuse, it's built to be reused, and it just falls right in line with the natural processes of what an efficient and effective agency is already doing. It's just giving you the tools to do it already. The process feels natural. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about how the designer and developers connect. This is where we really get into the idea of what's the difference between, in a process standpoint, of working with a classic editor versus working with the block editor. Typically, like I alluded to earlier, a designer provides page layouts to a developer, and then that's built by the developer. Then those layouts are then built by the developer, right? Now, any designer I've ever worked with at any agency, it's usually that, right? So it's either one, you're just you're given these PDF layouts and they're pre-made, and you build it, right? Or sometimes you'll end up with a designer who will actually give you the actual design system that they used to actually build those pages. So behind the scenes, most designers are literally doing that. They're actually creating blocks And then they're taking those blocks and they're building the layouts. But instead of giving you the blocks, they give you the layouts because that's all you need to build the site. But the block editor kind of turns that on its head. Now, instead of needing the layouts first, I need the blocks first. So I can take those blocks and I can build them and then afterward design the actual page layouts. Now, this has a couple of really, really awesome benefits that can save you a ton of time and cut down your lead times big time if you do it right. The first thing is, if you think about that, in the classic editor standpoint, the designer has to create the layout, create the blocks, create the components, the design system, right? And then after creating that system, they turn around and they create the layouts. And after those layouts are mostly created, at that point, they hand it to the developer and they say, okay, you can now start. Now compare that to the block editing experience, right? Where you can, the designer can build the components and build the layout and build the components and build the design system effectively with the idea and knowledge that these are going to be used as block editor blocks instead of just something that he or she are using for to be seen again. So then once those are built, and once there's some kind of agreement and consensus on how they look and how they're built, you can then at that point, before you even start building too many layouts and getting too far into that, you can hand that to the developers early while the designer is working with the rest of the team to figure out what these layouts and what these pages actually need to be built. So while they're figuring out how the rest of the site is being built, your developer or you is already working on getting those blocks started and getting them moving and setting up that design system that the designer has already thought through. Of course, there's going to be some changes and there's going to be some stuff, and maybe there'll be some times where you're redoing work or you're getting rid of something that you initially thought you were going to do. But if you do it, there's this moment that's just right where the layouts are starting to firm up a little bit, and you can typically hand those blocks a full week, maybe 2 weeks, sometimes even more than that earlier, and get the developer started. That leads to better lead times. That leads to allowing you to put more people, more websites on your queue. It just opens you up to a lot of opportunities that, if done effectively, can really make a difference. Okay, so those are kind of the big benefits that I noticed in my agency after I started working with the block editor. I think that those benefits are pretty clear and pretty amazing. There's definitely some things about it that were difficult. There's some learning curve. There's some challenges with learning how to use the actual block editor, especially in terms of training, right? So like I alluded to earlier, some clients just struggle with it because they are in a world where Microsoft Word is what they're looking for, and they're getting the block editor, and it's a very different experience. So I think the biggest thing I would think about is the training and how you onboard those people and how you can simplify that process by creating blocks that are simple to use for the ones who really need that kind of thing. And again, since you're doing it in ACF or lazy blocks, you can use things like the repeater field and all these other similar processes you're already familiar with. And you find that it's actually not that different than what you've been doing all along, or less different than you might actually think. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about template parts. So these are the fixed layout parts of a page. This is kind of the nitty gritty, the smallest piece of a classic editor theme that I can think of is what I call a template part, which is, if you're not familiar with it, basically it's a function inside of WordPress that allows you to call a very small snippet of code. And oftentimes developers will actually take these template parts and use them to kind of assemble a site. And even agree, sometimes they'll even darn near build blocks as template parts. And just not include them in the block editor and then have to hard code them in whenever it's necessary. But we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of scenarios here with the classic editor versus the block editor. So first up, let's lay out the world's most simple blog I can think about, which is literally a blog archive and a homepage, and that's it. So using the classic editor, your template parts and your components that make up that site might look something like this on the blog page and the home page. So you can see here, the template parts header is reused on both pages. Great. So that's some code that you're reusing in both places. And you can see pretty much everything but the footer. Only header and footer are really being reused on these, which is, to be fair, these are two very different layouts and they serve two different purposes. So that makes sense. However, so you've got all these template parts and you've got this site built and it's, looking good, but with the blog using a sidebar with a widget area, a hard-coded header, footer, blog content inside of the post content, and then you look at the home page and it's basically built using, ACF fields or, some kind of framework to allow you to basically pre-populate all of the content that goes inside of what we do and the homepage testimonials, a repeater field or something like that just shows testimonials. Maybe this is a query, hard-coded query that shows, recent posts on the blog. I don't know, something to that effect. But this is more or less how WordPress websites have been built for the past several years in the classic editor. And it's been pretty good, right? So because you can do a lot with this if you build it right. It's just there's always something that happens that throws a wrench in the gears. And in the case of this site, it's going to be a landing page. So maybe this was a part of the project, maybe not. Maybe this happened in a retainer at a later point. Regardless, let's say that at some point the customer says, we need a landing page. We've got this new product that we're launching and we're looking to start, getting some sales on it. Okay, great. Well, if you've ever built a landing page, you know that usually the header and footer is completely different than the header and footer on a lot of the other pages. At least some of the ones that are like hyper optimized, right? Where they don't have a navigation menu or any of that stuff. They really cut back on that stuff because they don't want you to exit this page. They want you to click through to a sale. So because of that alone, you now have to create a different template part for the header and the footer. And the header for the landing page is a little bit different than the home page. So it's a different template part. And then you've got this feature carousel that you want to have where it shows a different set of features. And that's different. And then the other thing is you've got this landing page list of features. Maybe you've got all these cards that are stacked up on a 3x3 column that shows, what makes this product that they're selling so great. So with that, you've just now created 5 more template parts, 5 more hard-coded parts, all for this one page that is in all likelihood not going to be used anywhere else unless they create another identical landing page where the content is just different, which is certainly possible. But you can kind of see here, regardless of if you're in a retainer and you have to get this page built, or if this was a part of the scope in the beginning of the project, the cost of doing this, doing the additional template parts and all the additional components and all the hard coding that has to happen in order to be able to modularize this landing page, it's going to cost. It's going to add cost because you're adding code, you're writing more code, you're doing more stuff. So that's not ideal. One scenario that happens inside of WordPress. Now, eventually this stops, right? You build all the pages that the client needs and it has all the different templates and they're good to go and it's all great. But how much code did you have to build to get to that point? Now, and I also want to make one other mention that it's possible that inside of these template parts, they might reuse some pieces of the template parts in other places. Like, for example, maybe this page header has a lot of HTML and CSS that is going to be used in the landing page header. So it wouldn't be that bad to build it, but it would still at the end of the day, you have to touch it with code. Now, let's talk through that same exact scenario with blocks. So blocks, again, are fixed layout parts of a page, exactly like what I said earlier with template parts. They're really the same thing. The only difference is that blocks allow you to change and use those template parts directly inside of the block editor, whereas a template part doesn't have that. Like a native template part in the classic editor just doesn't do that. You have to make a code change to be able to do that. So I always have kind of thought about it that way, where blocks are basically just template parts that happen to be able to be used inside of the block editor. And when you think about it that way, you kind of realize, holy cow, I mean, we're already doing this. We just haven't given ourselves non-developers, whether it's the client or somebody else on your team, project managers or something, or even the developer really, an opportunity to be able to use those without having to bring in some developer to make the change. So again, let's look at how this block-based approach handles that exact problem. Okay, so we'll start with the simple situation of the blog layout and the home layout. Here you can see, basically this is going to be built out of, I would build this out of 3 different widget areas, one for the header, one for the sidebar, and one for the footer. And as of the 5.8 version of WordPress, widgets can actually use blocks. So if you declare a widget area, you're kind of able to basically create blocks that persist across pages. It's pretty amazing, to be honest. And if you look at this, you can see, okay, we're using an image block, a navigation menu block, and this would probably be in a columns block. And there would probably have to be some custom CSS to make the navigation menu work. But that can be done using some wrapper classes inside of the block or targeting it in some fashion. If you look at the side here, we've got an ad block, an email block, a contact block. I don't really know. It depends on what's going to happen over here. But the point is there would be content blocks here that persist in the blog. And then down here, you have, again, another columns block with 3 columns with an image block, probably the logo or something, another navigation menu, and then maybe a contact form, or maybe it's another navigation menu or something. Who knows? But the point is these are blocks. You can change these whenever you want, however you want. And then this is just basically the content itself. So instead of just showing the template part of the content, I wanted to show that there's a heading block instead of the heading template part. And this would just be a reusable block that can be just plopped, that could be plopped in on every single post. You could also hard code that in if you really don't want to mess with reusable blocks. You could even make it a widget area that says, before content and after content, and just put some blocks in there. There's so many different ways you can approach this, but you can do it using blocks. And then inside are all the individual blocks that actually make the blog post itself. Now, if we look over here on the home layout, you can see we're using the same widget area for the header and the footer. And a custom-made heading block, a set of feature blocks, a carousel block, and a post query block. So this carousel block could be built custom. It could be built, it could be found using GhostKit or something like that if you want. Same with feature blocks. This would probably just be a single feature block inside of a columns block. And you can see how that page, if we compare it to the other one, lays out very similar. So the feature block, this is what we do, right? This is the testimonials carousel. This is the recent blog posts, and this is the opening paragraph to the thing. But notice something here. The heading block here is being used here in the blog post content too, because the content of the heading block, this block is identical to this block. It just happens to be inside of a smaller container, and what actually makes it work can be done in the same fashion as the heading block, depending on how you build it. If you build it to where you say, show this post title instead of just adding your own custom title, you can do that. So now you're already starting to reuse blocks in ways that you weren't able to do, and we've only actually touched 2 layouts. So what happens whenever we throw in the wrench that we threw in last time, which is the landing page? You see here, the only significant change is the header and the footer. You might have to add some logic to basically say, don't show these on a landing page. And typically, whenever I build websites using the block editor, I actually just create a page template for all of them that just doesn't use the header or footer widget area at all. And so you can see how that's a combination of template plus blocks. So now I'm using this template that's basically a template that has no header and no footer, and it's literally just a blank page with my style sheets. And from there, I can literally build this entire page using nothing but the block editor if I want to go completely custom. And that's exactly what we're doing here with the landing page. Up top and a text block to serve as like a pseudo simplified header, right? Maybe there's a call to action here for the text or an introductory text. And again, we're using that heading block right here, but we're using it inside of a columns block. And then we're using a CTA block, which could potentially be used over here on the sidebar instead of an ad block or an email block. We're reusing the carousel block that we used down here, as well as the feature blocks right here. And then again, there's another CTA block here that is the same as this one here. It's just not inside of a columns block, so it just works a little bit differently. So you can see this is a bit of an idealistic scenario, of course, but you can see how if you use blocks and you think about them in that fashion, you can see how this entire landing page could have been built without knowing that we needed to build it after the fact without writing any extra code. And that's really the fundamental magic and beauty of the block editor. That's what makes it so powerful and so useful, really. Okay, so now that we've touched on that, let's get into building custom blocks and some different ways to just get it done. I've kind of touched on it several times throughout this talk, but just to really hammer it home, the first one is using a block editor plugin like ACF or Lazy Block plugins, Lazy Blocks or something like that. I think this is a great starting point. And a lot, especially for my own personal sites when I'm trying to get something built quickly and intend to rebuild that in a more robust way later. This is an awesome way to get started because it lets you figure out what you need to prototype that block quickly. And then if you are finding that you're using it all the time and you want it to have a better editing experience, you can always do that later. But I think this is a great starting point. Like I said, it works a lot like the ACF-based process you're probably already used to right now, and it's going to feel really familiar. It's by far the quickest way to make blocks right now. No code or very little code is required to be able to do this, and certainly no JavaScript knowledge is required. You could do this using just PHP or the tools that you already have and the knowledge you already have. So it's a pretty great place to start. The disadvantages of this approach is that I find it to be a little bit more difficult to reuse this stuff on another site. If you've ever been in a situation where you have a set of ACF fields that you want to use across different sites, or even just trying to migrate them to a live site, you know it's kind of a pain because you have to export this JSON file or put it in your theme in some way, or manage this array of fields or something like that. It's kind of an annoying process. And it especially gets annoying whenever you start trying to manage that across multiple sites, because then if you add a field to one, you have to update that across all of them, and it just really becomes a mess real quick. And it also, another disadvantage of this, particularly with ACF right now, is that editing with these feels kind of clunky. So if you're working in the block editor and you're typing and you're in this flow and you're adding headings and you're adding paragraphs, and then you get to this point where you have to add custom block, maybe it's a code snippet block or something like that. You get to it and you go, okay, let's add the code snippet block. And you type in the shortcut key to open up your custom block and you hit it in, and then bam, it shows this set of ACF fields that are just kind of shoved into the Gutenberg block editor. And you have to stop typing, go over to your mouse, click on all the fields and determine how it works. It kind of breaks the flow for sure. So it does feel clunky. It's not as great as working with a native block, but again, it's way faster and it's a great way to prototype those blocks or just to be able to get those blocks built on a budget. And to be honest, that clunkiness isn't that severe whenever you're working on building page layouts. It's really only notably bad whenever you're trying to use it inside of like post content or something like that, where somebody's using the block editor as a writing tool, not a page layout tool. The other option, of course, is to use custom written blocks, writing, React, JavaScript, and PHP. This is kind of more like building your own custom solution with, let's say if you're in the classic editor, you would probably have to build custom meta boxes and save it to post meta and grab that post meta directly. And, there's all this extra stuff that you have to do that ACF just kind of does for you. This is kind of there's more time involved. It requires knowledge of newer technologies like React and JavaScript that you or the people on your team may not know yet. It also takes a little bit more time to build because, again, you have to do everything. You have to save the content in. You have to add it to the meta. You have to figure out, what the actual editing experience is like, which adds a whole nother layer of complexity and takes a bit more time. However, like I said before, it's not that bad once you know what you're doing and you have a good reason to need to be able to build it in a custom fashion. The big benefit about writing your own custom blocks is that you don't need external dependencies for it to work, right? I think back to, I have this ACF horror story of mine where I had a client a few years ago who they wanted me to fix their site. It was working really slow and they were having problems with it. So I say, okay, let's see what we can do. So I get in there and I look in ACF. I don't even know what version it was, but it was several major versions back because they just never updated their site. And it was so old that I literally could not update ACF to the newest version. And I actually had to manually install the plugin step by step, and it still didn't work. We ended up having to completely rebuild their site because it was just so old. I literally couldn't get it updated and secure without redoing it. And I think about that a lot whenever I think about using things like ACF or Lazy Blocks or even Elementor or any of these site builders. I like to use them as a starting point, as a crutch to get started, but I don't like to use them as a permanent solution because of things like that. I don't want to be handed a project like that. I would hate to have to hand that to somebody else. I'd also hate to have have that fall on my shoulders or there's some kind of problem of that sort. Life gets easier with every time you can remove a plugin from your site, right? Without sacrificing functionality and utility. So at some point, I think custom written blocks are just a very important step. And then finally, like I alluded to, the editing experience of native Gutenberg blocks feels so much more intuitive. It just feels like it's a part of the system. It was always a part of the system. And that feels really good. I think that a lot of what we as developers sell these days is not only a website that works really well, but I think really it's the experience that our customers have in interfacing with the stuff that we vouch for. It's kind of like insurance, right? You don't buy the contract, you're buying the peace of mind, right? Our peace of mind is in part this editing experience. And I think that's a very important piece of the puzzle. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the relevant resources that I've touched on here. ACF, Advanced Custom Fields. There's a way that you can use that to build custom blocks really quickly. Lazy Blocks is an alternative to ACF. It's specific to the block editor. And I think that the blocks feel less clunky than the ones in ACF because it was built specifically to work in the editor. You still get a lot of the functionality that ACF has, like the repeater field and really cool stuff. And I've had a lot of luck with it. So those are both really great choices to consider if you're looking to get started. I'm going to talk about both of those a lot in the next talk next week. And we're going to actually look at some examples and kind of get into how to build a block with them. I also have a related WordPress WP Dev Academy post here. It's a bit.ly link because the link was way too long. It's a post I wrote a couple weeks ago a post I published a couple weeks ago, rather, that talks about this. It talks about how the block editor fundamentally has changed how we write themes and how we approach themes. And it kind of expands on that process bit that I talked about a little bit at the midpoint here. So definitely recommend that you take a look at that post and give it a read. I think that it'll kind of help really hammer home some of the points I talked about in this talk. And finally, the Ghost Kit plugin is one of the many block libraries out there, but it just happens to be one that I really like. It's a free, it's currently a free block library that's on WordPress. It seems to be the most popular one. Lazy Blocks actually integrates directly with it, so you can actually use Lazy Blocks plus Ghost Kit and kind of get a lot of really cool benefits and really cool extensions without spending any extra money. What's really cool is Ghost Kit also has some pre-made layouts. So if you have this landing page template and you don't have a designer and you just need to get a landing page up and going, they have pre-made layouts that you can click on, and it runs this little script that just places the whole doggone set of blocks that are needed to create a pre-made layout of a landing page for you, and you just fill it in. It's really cool. So I've actually built entire websites, like I said, just using the core block editor, and I've also done it using the block editor plus Ghost Kit, and then whatever necessary, I usually pepper in Lazy Blocks. Okay, so with all that, I do want to mention, I alluded to this earlier this morning at the start of this talk. Right after this talk, I'm going to be doing a roundtable discussion with members of the WordPress WP Dev Academy Discord community. I'm still going to take questions in this talk by all means, but I'm going to actually go, as soon as this is done, directly to my Discord server, join into that, and basically just sit with the people who have decided to come in. This is going to be a little bit more informal. It's going to be more conversational, and it's going to be focused on just answering and discussing things in a more conversational manner. So if you find that you can't really get that itch scratch, that question answered, or you just kind of want to sit down and just talk to me or talk to other people about this more, by all means, go to this community, go to the community.wpdevacademy, join the server, and come on into the channel called Stage, and I'll be there waiting for you. On this channel, we also discuss, in our community, we also talk about other things like we share WordPress job opportunities. So if you are an agency and you're looking to hire somebody, you can by all means post in there. We talk about development discussion all the time. And we're looking into getting into more things like WordPress TV watch parties and all kinds of really cool stuff. So I'd love to see you there. Obviously, it's not required, but if it's something you're interested in, I'd love to see you there. To connect with me, the best way to do so is on Twitter at Alex Standiford. I also publish content on my personal website, alexstandiford.com. That's basically, I don't actually publish content on there. It's basically syndicated. So I publish my stuff everywhere. I publish, and that stuff all just kind of feeds into alexstandiford.com. So if you wanted to see just kind of like a big picture, what's going on with my life or where I'm writing or what I'm writing about, that's a great place to start. Okay. Thanks. That sums it up. I'm now ready to take some questions. So if anybody has any, I'm ready to go.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, that was super helpful. I've limited insight into blocks, but certainly on the support queue, we definitely see things where people have stopped working with their developer who's done some custom stuff, and then it's just troubleshooting and finding your way back becomes an issue. So thank you.
It's a mess. It's always a mess.
So we have a question from Alan Charlesworth in the chat area. If I make an ACF block and then decide to rebuild it as a custom block later, can I replace the existing ACF block, or do I have to run both?
So yeah, that's a good question. You'd have to run both for a little bit. You're going to have to rebuild it and reintroduce that block manually, but you might be able to do some kind of script that does it. But honestly, I've always just redone it. Find that the aren't super all over the place. Like they're usually like in a couple of very key places, except for, ironically enough, WP Dev Academy's site, where I actually am facing this exact problem. But honestly, I've kind of just resigned myself to running a WP query that searches for that specific block, so I know everywhere where it's at, and then I just turn that into a to-do list, and I just go through and I just change them. It kind of sucks, but that's kind of the price. I still think that's going to be faster than building it custom first, because if you build it custom first, you're going to be taking in a lot more changes and doing a lot more stuff that's slower. It's a lot faster to make those changes in ACF. So that time you lose in manually replacing all of those blocks is generally going to be recouped and then some by using ACF first.
Alan, thank you for the question. Yeah, if you have any follow-up question, by all means, add that back into the Q&A. We have another question from Elaine, and let's see if there's more clarification on this, but she's essentially wondering about accessibility when it comes to blocks. If you can talk a little bit about that.
It's a real concern. There's been accessibility audits that have been happening with it, and a lot of people feel like it's not there. And I think that really depends on the client and depends on their needs. And I think that the unfortunate reality is you kind of have to just look at the audits and make a choice from that. But I wouldn't blame you one bit if you decided to stick with the classic editor until the block editor was ready for that. Wouldn't blame you one bit.
Thank you. We have another question from Marcus. If I change a reusable block, will those changes persist to wherever I've used it?
No, I wish. I mean, yes and no. So, okay, yes, if you change a reusable block, it will persist everywhere where you use it. What it doesn't do is you can't overwrite any of that. So the block is fixed, right? And anytime you use it, it changes across the board, like what you're saying. But what it doesn't do is, like, say I have this block and I have a header and I have content inside of that, and I want to change that content, but I still want to put that reusable block everywhere. I can't just change that content. It's going to be fixed everywhere. I am anxiously awaiting that feature, because that is something that I think would take the Gutenberg block editing experience from being pretty good to this is genuinely awesome.
Thank you. Another question from Mark is, are there ways to create or add blocks for my client that they cannot change? Or maybe they can change only some parts of it?
I'm honestly not sure. I know that there's been discussion around the idea of making it possible to lock blocks, but I haven't seen anything concrete. But man, you want to talk about a really cool plugin idea. Make something where you can set it up to where a specific role can access it and edit the content of the blocks, but can't move them around. I don't know. I have to look into that, but it seems like a feature that would be really important, considering how many people are concerned about the usability of this for the less techie people. And I think that's would be a really good solution.
One question for you, which is, what resources did you turn to when learning JavaScript and React?
Wes Boss, he's the man. He's got JavaScript 30. He's got Node.js for developer, Learn Node, and he's also got a really for beginners course. It's not a one-to-one, of course, as always with WordPress. Everything is done a little bit differently the WordPress way, right? But that's what got me started. That's what got me going. A natural extension of that, of course, is not to plug my own thing, but I've got a plugin course that literally teaches how to build blocks inside of WordPress. So what I would recommend is that you start with learning React, learning JavaScript, and then go into those WordPress specific courses like my own at WP Dev Academy, or there's also JS for WP. He's got some pretty good resources too. He actually saved my skin on a project that I did a while back. I needed to learn something and I couldn't figure out how to do it when I was just getting started, and he happened to have a course that covered that perfectly. So either one of those are really great options.
Thank you. And Courtney has shared the link in the chat as well. Another question from Marcus, and we've all seen bloat in certain WordPress sites. And his question is there a benefit to having one plugin with 30 blocks and using 10 of them over just 10 plugins, each with one block?
Well, that really, I hate to say it, but that depends. Because it doesn't depend on the scenario, really. It just depends on how that plugin is built. If you are including and setting up every one of those blocks to always be loaded on every page load, that's definitely going to have a negative impact on your site. But if you're using an auto loader and you're using some things that are, even moderately modern at this point in your plugin, there's really no harm in doing it all in one. Because you can make it to where the system is smart enough to know this block isn't used on this page. Don't even bother asking me about it. I mean, to a point. Obviously, you're registering blocks all the time, so that's always going to happen. But I've never really seen any noticeable disadvantage, especially because, again, it's not like, in most cases, you're probably not going to end up building a lot of blocks. You're probably only going to build maybe a dozen or 2 dozen, and that's not going to make a difference whatsoever.
Great. And we have one last question before we wrap up.
Okay.
And it's from Courtney as well. As we look to block-based themes, do you think most website creators will now need to code to get the layouts they want?
I think that we're working in a I think that developers, the need for us to write custom code is moving from building layouts and building websites and building yet another navigation menu to building blocks and building the components and giving everybody the tools they need to do it instead. And I think that I even alluded to it, now technically you can do it. You don't have to, we're talking about full site editing and all these features that are coming in the later versions. With this widget area functionality and the ability to put blocks in, that's now. That's the reality right now. If you had a theme that had a couple of widget areas that were placed appropriately, you could 100% build a site from scratch and have some really great results without a developer.
Great. Thank you.
Did that answer the question? I think that answered the question.
Well, let's see what
Sorry.
back with. So we're almost on time here.
Sure.
What I do want to mention is this was part 1 of 3 in this series. So the next 2 parts are going to be over the next 2 weeks. We'll put the links in chat. You can also go to the GoDaddy events website to see an RSVP if you haven't done so already. And I also want to mention there's currently next week there's a meetup for email marketing during the holiday season, and basically as we head into Black Friday, Cyber Monday, how to get your store really ready. So those will be coming in chat, and they're also on the GoDaddy events website. Alex, thank you so much once again. Yeah. So that's all we have time for today. There are a bunch of links in the chat. There will be a recording for this sent after in the newsletter. If you have any thoughts about today's meetup, let us know on Twitter at GoDaddy Pro. Other than that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Alex, once again. And we hope to see everybody next week. Thank you.
Till next time.